Good afternoon, or good morning, or good day for any of you listening around the world. Welcome to another edition of Ask Leo Live. A couple of housekeeping points. For one thing, do realize that there's like a 15 to 20-second delay between my actually saying something and you're seeing it. That is YouTube's fastest live event that they can do. Also, if you have questions anytime during this presentation, by all means, use the chat right there should be right there alongside the YouTube video window, at least if you're watching on a desktop or laptop PC. I think that's really only the housekeeping that I wanted to throw out there. The questions, by the way, can certainly be about what we're talking about. And of course, especially at the end, I'm wide open to questions about just about anything you might have questions about. So, Gmail is what I want to talk about mostly today. If we have some time, we might touch on Outlook.com, but I want to focus mostly on Gmail. Gmail is an email service from Google, and it is probably the most popular email provider today. Certainly when I take a look at the statistics for what's happening on askleo.com, the website, the places that I get email from, the number of subscribers to my newsletter, Gmail is by far the most represented. However, what I find interesting is that Gmail has a ton of features and user interface, I'll just call them quirks, that I think a lot of people don't know about. Don't understand, and perhaps might appreciate Gmail even a little bit more than just using the default setup. So the idea here today is to walk through the Gmail user interface and then walk through the Gmail settings, of which there are many, and kind of sort of explain them and talk about when they might be useful, when they wouldn't be useful, and which ones I use, because I do use many of them. I definitely have Gmail customized fairly dramatically, my personal Gmail, and we'll just sort of take it from there. So again, if you have questions about what you're seeing on the screen, then by all means hit the chat window. I'm keeping an eye open on it as we go through the material. So with that in mind, let's put Gmail on the screen. There I am. So what you're looking at, of course, is my Windows 10 Home example machine and Gmail, Google Mail, logged into one of my example Gmail accounts. So the place I want to start, I mean, it's no real logical place to start, so I'll just start in the upper left as usual. So this, they call it their main menu. All that really is this stuff that's down here on the side. Clicking on that, this, by the way, is often referred to as a hamburger icon because if you look at it the right way, it looks like a slab of beef between two slices of bread. It is nothing more than a way to hide the items that are on the left-hand side. I actually never do this. It's one of those things where I've got enough screen real estate that it's useful to actually have this all present. But if you're tight on screen real estate, this can be a useful thing to use to minimize the items there on the left-hand menu. The Gmail logo itself actually doesn't do anything. It actually, when you click on it, I believe it just takes you back to your inbox if you happen to be somewhere else. We'll talk about search shortly. This, of course, the question mark circled is the help button. The help basically is limited to either online knowledge base articles, in other words, answers that Google has already written, and they've written plenty. Training, basically, I believe these are online training videos and other articles that they've written to help you learn how to use Gmail. Updates, essentially a reference to what's changed lately in Gmail, and then send feedback. Now, there are those who would say that send feedback is a way to make it feel like you've told Google something, but they don't really pay any attention to it. My belief is that they probably get plenty of feedback, and that while a human may not actually watch or read every message that goes to the send feedback alias or send feedback mechanism, I'm pretty sure that they have some automation, perhaps even some AI, that's taking a look at the feedback that goes there and identifies common trends and common terminology so as to raise the things that people are providing feedback about the most. The gear is, of course, the settings icon. I'm going to come back to that because we're going to be spending a fair amount of time there here shortly. This little 3x3 grid is really a shortcut to all of Google Apps. I'll talk about that in just a second because I wanted to talk first about this one here, this A. This is essentially a link to a menu that refers not necessarily to your Gmail account, but to your Google account. And you can see that it actually talks about managing your Google account. One of my recent articles on askleo was, what's the difference between an email address, an email account, an email service, and an email program? And Gmail is one of the canonical examples of that because it is an email address, an email service, and an email account, but it's not an email program. All that really is to say that when you sign up, when you create a Gmail account so that you get email, what you're actually creating is a Google account. And associated with that Google account are a large number of other Google services. So that's what this 3x3 menu is all about. These are shortcuts to most, but not all, of the services that Google provides you by virtue of having a Google account. So one of the things people don't realize about this, of course, is that this menu is customizable. What does that mean? Well, what that means is if I use Gmail a lot, and I would really rather have that be at the top, I can click, hold, and drag, and it gets moved to the position that I put it in. Similarly, if I never ever use Google Play on my PC, I can just drag that down to somewhere else. Chrome, I use that a lot. Maps I use a lot. This is a quick way to get to contacts. My Google account, we've already seen. There are other ways to get to it. Google Duo and Google Meet, and we'll talk about those in a few minutes, but those are things that I don't use very often. You get the idea. Whatever set of Google services you happen to use frequently, it's actually worth spending a couple of minutes customizing what shows up here in this Google Services dropdown so that you get quicker and easier access to the services that you actually use. So the reason, of course, I moved account down here is because, of course, it's right here. The other thing that most people don't realize is that this A here, it's a placeholder. It's nothing more than a placeholder. What you can replace it with, and you've seen it on some of my other accounts if you've ever gotten email from me, is that I actually have an icon or a headshot or a photo of some sort. At least one of my Google accounts has a corgi as an image here. And clicking on the camera, of course, gives you the opportunity to either upload a photo to be used for this or select from any photos you've previously uploaded into Google Photos. You can tell here that I haven't uploaded any photos yet, so I would have to select a photo from my computer, upload it, and then I'd be able to set it as the image, the profile picture that shows up for my Google account. This would then also update this little A in the upper right-hand corner to reflect a small version of that same image. So that's a great way to customize the account. It's also what ends up showing up in a few other places, including when other people examine your account, when they try to find you, when they're getting email from you, if they happen to be on Gmail themselves, if they're looking at Google services, if you're sharing Google Photos, this is the image that would show up in all of those cases. Obviously, there's a lot more you can configure about your Google account. I'm not going to get into Google accounts specifically, but this is where you would go to do things like change your password, update your security, Change your alternate email addresses. Make sure that the alternate email addresses and alternate phone numbers are all set properly. There's a lot associated with your Gmail or your Google account, but this is the way to get to it, or this is one way to get to it. You don't have to go through Gmail to get to it, but I just find this one of the most convenient and easiest ways to get there because I'm always in Gmail. I live in Gmail. I actually live in 2 instances of Gmail, which, as it turns out, brings up something else. It is now not uncommon and certainly acceptable to have multiple Google email accounts. And you can, in fact, if you like, reference them both from the same instance of Gmail. You can see here it says add another account. If I click on that, it's actually going to go through the login process, and I would log in using the credentials for a second separate Gmail account. Then, once having done so, I would then be able to, on this menu, switch between the accounts that I've logged into. So it would actually replace the entire inbox with whatever other account I happen to be looking at. It's a convenient way to manage multiple accounts if you have multiple Google accounts, as I do, as you might expect. The only time it gets confusing, and I do want to mention this because I think a lot of people run into this problem from time to time, is that if you've got multiple accounts, one of those accounts, the first one that you sign into, is kind of sort of the default account for this particular browser. So that when you go to gmail.com after you open the browser, it's that first account that's going to open up automatically. Similarly, if you open up one of the other Google services, sometimes it will open the service for the default account, not necessarily the account that you happen to be in if you're looking at multiple email accounts. So it's just something to be aware of. I've run into enough confusion from time to time personally that my approach to dealing with multiple accounts is ever so slightly different. I actually run 2 different browsers. I will run, in fact, literally right now on another screen on my computer, I have Google Chrome running one Gmail account, and then I have Microsoft Edge logged into a second one. It's the difference between business and personal for me. I have a personal Gmail account and I have a business Gmail account, and I simply run them in 2 separate browsers. It is possible, and I've also done this, to fire up an incognito window or in private window in your browser, and then use that to log into a second or other Gmail account. The only problem there is that while you're not able to easily switch between the 2 in the same window, you have separate windows. You'll have separate windows for that. Once you close that in private window, you'll have lost your logged in state. Whereas here, since I've hit remember me, even if I close this browser and fire it back up again, it will reopen to this same Gmail account already logged in. So that's the top line with the exception of settings. We'll come back to settings shortly. Compose, I think you understand, that's how you get yourself a new message. We're not using signatures. We'll talk about those when we talk about settings as well. The interesting thing that, again, a number of people don't quite realize is that you can change the new message window. If you just click on it, you can see I've hidden it, or I've minimized it in a sense. It's not a true minimize in the Windows sense, but it's still here in my browser window down at the bottom out of the way. That's a great way to go back to your inbox if you need to suddenly read another email that just came in while you're composing a message. Clicking on it again brings it back up. The little bar here is in fact that same minimize. And then this one, full screen, that's the one that actually makes it full screen. In other words, it's going to take over the entire browser window. It's not truly full screen. You can tell I've still got lots of screen real estate around my browser window. I've still got kind of a border within my browser window, but it's basically opened up a large editing window for the message that I happen to be working on. And then, of course, I can go back to the normal size by clicking on that same icon again. The interesting thing, and you probably saw the tooltip, Shift for pop out. That's one that I think people really, don't always catch on to, and it's so incredibly handy. If I hit Shift and now click on it, what I now have is a completely separate window. So now I can go back, I can come back here, I can do whatever I want. I've got two separate windows that can be managed completely independently of one another. And that can sometimes be a significantly easier way to manage the email you have under construction, as well as being able to deal with your inbox. And by the way, if you then maximize this window, in other words, I'm not maximizing the little editing thing that Gmail brought up, but I'm actually maximizing this browser window, then you've got a true full screen interface to, or as full a screen as you're going to get in Gmail to edit that message. So that's handy. Like I said, it is something that I think a lot of people don't know. This brings it back into its normal popped in session, so it becomes part of the parent window. And then of course the X here in the upper right does a save and close. Now, I want to check something. Yeah, it doesn't have any drafts. What a lot of people do, and I see this all the time, is people will do something. They'll, start a message. They'll hit escape. That's what I did, is I just hit the escape key. And that actually is the same as clicking on the X, and that made the window go away. What it did, though, is it saved it in drafts. And it is amazing the number of people I have run into that have multiple messages in their drafts folder because they didn't realize that what they just closed by perhaps quickly hitting the escape key actually got saved. So that's something to be aware of. Check your drafts from time to time. If you truly are done with a message that you're composing, we're not going to send it anywhere, you literally want to make it go away, that's what the garbage can icon is for. And it's gone. We have no drafts. To continue across the top here, this is a selection box. And what it allows you to do is some quick checkbox selection of the messages that might be in the folder you're looking at. As you can see, we have only one message here, so I could just click on that checkbox. But if I had multiples, this would allow me to select all of them, to select only the unread ones, the starred ones, etc., the various different things that it offers here. That's a quick way to select those. Why would you want to select those? Well, as you can see, we have things we can do once messages have been selected. We can archive them. We can report them as spam. We can delete them, where delete really is delete. And we'll talk about the difference between archiving and delete here in a second. We can mark them as having been read. The current message you can see is marked as, it's in bold, which means that it has not yet been read. We can snooze. I believe that means we'll make the message disappear for a while. And we can add it to tasks. There are so many different task solutions there. I'll be blunt. I don't use Google's tasks. I prefer something with a little bit more global scope. We can move to. Move to simply assigns labels, which is also what the labels button does. And of course, there's more things you can do to it. Marking as read, marking as not important. You can add stars to it. Filtering we'll talk about shortly. Muting basically hides the conversation that you happen to be in, and you can forward that message. Forwarding the message is different than forwarding as an attachment. So here I've clicked on the message so that we can see it. You can see the only option that is immediately visible is, of course, a reply. But if we click on the vertical ellipses, these three dots that are in the upper right-hand corner of the message, we get more options, and we can do things like forward and a number of other things. If we forward the message, we automatically create a new message that has the old message as its body with nothing filled out. So I could choose who I was going to send this to, and I could forward the message on. On the other hand, if we go back to the inbox, this one is selected, and we say forward as attachment. What that does instead is it creates a .eml file. .eml is actually a pseudo-industry standard for what an email message contains. I believe when you forward it as an attachment in this way, it actually includes all of the headers that you don't normally see in an email message. Those can be very useful. When trying to diagnose what's going on with a message, where it comes from. So if you're sending a message to someone else for that kind of diagnosis, that is something worth knowing, that this would be the way to do it. When you just forward the message, all you're really forwarding is the content of the message and not all of that additional information. I'm reading a question here. So what about containers? Honestly, I'm not sure what you're referring to with respect to containers. It's not a term I'm seeing or have run across here with respect to Gmail or browsers. So if you want to clarify that, that'd be great, but it's not something I'm not exactly sure what it is you're referring to. So to go back to the message here for a moment, viewing the headers is something that a lot of people like to do because it can tell them a lot more about the authenticity of a message, whether or not the message is spam, and other interesting things. And that is what Show Original is all about. What that does is that shows you the original message with all of the geeky overhead as it came from its original source. You can see here, there's some of the information that is called out, interpreted by Gmail as it's showing you that, and you can of course copy that to the clipboard. But the real interesting stuff, the meat of the message, if you will, is all of this stuff down here. These, whenever I talk about the headers that you don't normally see, this is what I'm talking about. There's a lot of information here. All relating to things like authentication and spam, and is this really coming from who you think it's coming from? What servers did it touch on the way from its original source to the destination? Just any number of different things. It's actually really worth spending a few minutes and looking at some of the information that is present on the in the headers, because you'll get an idea of just not only how incredibly complicated email has become, but you'll get an idea of how much effort is being put into trying to identify spam, identify legitimate mail, and how much it's actually adding to the overhead of every message. Now, in this case, the message we are sending, or we're getting here, is what's called multi-part, which means that the message is actually included twice in the body, in the actual message. And the difference is that it is simply encoded in two different ways. You can see this divider line here. There's this boundary here where it says multi-part alternative. The boundary is a line that indicates where one version of the message begins, and then the boundary between it and the next. This first one would be the plain text message. You can't see it this way because it's encoded a little specially, but this would be the version that is viewed if your email program does not support HTML or rich text mail. The other one, the text HTML version, is the version that is displayed in your email program or interface if it does support HTML, which is something that most email programs do these days. The transfer encoding is why you're seeing all of this funky looking text. It's actually the HTML encoded in what's called base 64. The horrible truth about email is that it actually doesn't support all possible characters. All of the characters that you're used to using, things, I'll just use smileys and emoticons as an example, or emojis even as an example, because those actually are individual characters in a character set that has thousands and thousands and thousands of characters. The underlying protocols that allow email to get sent from one place to another don't support thousands and thousands of characters. In fact, in the worst case, I think they only support 127, which means they then have to go through this kind of a hoop to encode everything, restricting that encoding to those 127 characters, which is why this looks the way it looks. You can get some command line tools or other tools to decode it for you if you are terminally curious, or your email program's doing it for you. Right here is that message displayed in HTML because, of course, Gmail understands HTML. Let's see. What else are we going to talk on this menu? So, of course, we can filter messages like this. Filtering is something that I'm going to come back to. Print is also not something I'm going to spend a lot of time on today, simply because it is one of those functions that can get really complicated really quick. I will just say that when you do print a message, you will be given a preview. It shows you what it looks like before it's going to print. And 9 times out of 10, I use it for save as PDF. That's a great way to save something to print later, because you know that you can print a PDF. But it's also a great way to save an email in its original form, the way it looked when you got it. Let's see. Report spam and report phishing, you know what those are all about. Show the original we just talked about. Translate message can be useful. I use it from time to time, especially since I do get messages in Dutch from some relatives, and my Dutch is a little rusty. Usually Google will identify that there is a foreign language in your message and actually include an offer up at the top of the message to translate it for you. But if they don't, you can actually translate the message manually by hitting this one. Download the message, I believe, is going to download the EML file, and mark as unread does exactly that. It marks it as unread. So we're back in our inbox with the message marked as if it had not been read. So there are a couple things here that are new, and honestly, Meet and Hangouts, I'm going to show you how to get rid of those, because they are not something that I ever use. The vast majority of people aren't using these things these days, and it's just more real estate that they take up. We'll get to that in just a second when we dive into settings. On the far left, far right here, we have an icon that will take us to our calendar, another that will take us to Google Keep, their note-taking application, another that will take us to the Tasks application. And of course, you can add more things to Google. Now, as I noted earlier, a lot of these things, like especially the calendar, is right here in this drop-down menu. So I don't necessarily care to have this here. That's what this little icon all the way down at the bottom is. That allows you to hide that panel and simply make it go away and give you that 1/4 inch of additional space on your screen. That's how I run. I run with that hidden all the time because I never ever use those little icons. If you want it back, of course, that's what this show side panel icon turns into. Let's see. Lastly, on the main screen here, the amount of disk space you're using on your email account, which actually goes across your entire Google account. So anything you've got associated with Google Photos, Google Drive, would actually count against this 15 gigabyte default size. Of course, they've got their terms and privacies. And then, of course, there's this last account activity, which is actually kind of useful to understand to make sure you understand where your account is being used. It can quickly get confusing. You can see that we have several different things showing the kinds of access that are happening. Almost all of them are going to be this browser looking at this email. So that's what this is. That's the browser that I'm running is in fact Edge, even though it's being misrepresented as Chrome in this list. It's showing an IPv6 IP address, so that's how I'm actually being connected to Google itself, and exactly when that was, and you can see that it's current. The one that I think that confuses a lot of people is this one, authorized application. You can see it's probably, well, it's not quite from the same IP address because that changed. But what an authorized application is an application that, as you might imagine, you have authorized to access your email account. What application might that be? Well, you'll notice here I've got Microsoft Mail down here, the desktop email program associated with Windows 10. And in fact, I have the Gmail account configured in that desktop email program. So that's what this is. That's what these authorized applications are. Depending on the applications you use, be it a mail programs like a Microsoft Office, Outlook, or Thunderbird, or the mail program with Windows 10, or potentially a mobile application that is looking at your email, or potentially another web application. For example, if you suck up your Gmail into your Outlook.com account, which is certainly something you can do, then you might also need to grant that kind of authorization. But that's what's going on here. The thing that I pay the most attention to is the location. If all of a sudden that were to say Lagos, Nigeria, I would change my password, right? I would do absolutely everything, because that implies that there's something going on that I didn't intend for. So that's a useful thing to know about, and I suggest you just take a peek at it from time to time. And again, that's something that applies to, I believe, your entire Google account, not just Gmail. Okay, enough. Let's go dive into the settings. First, there's the common settings. Excuse me there for a minute. I have to have a little bit of something to drink. You can configure just how dense the display is to be. By default, it comes up with a fair amount of space in between messages. I tend to like really compact messages. The inbox type, I'm skipping the theme here for a second. The inbox type, this is the default. You can have it put the messages that have been marked important first, or the messages that haven't yet been read first, or the messages that have been starred first, or you can play with priority inboxes, or you can have multiple inboxes. Again, most of this is stuff that for the most part, most people don't need to play with. But if these end up being features that you'll use, and we will touch on them briefly, then they may be a useful way for you to manage your email. The reading pane, I think a lot of people don't realize that the reading pane even exists, and I suspect that it's a recent addition. The reading pane is something that you're probably very familiar with in other email programs, where you have not only a list of email messages, but the actual email message, the first email message or the currently selected email message, is displayed either to the right of the list or below it. So if I were to turn on below, of course it has to reload the interface to make a massive change, you can see now that there is this window down here, or this pane down here, that actually has nothing in it. However, if I now click on this message, then all of a sudden it simply shows. So we didn't have to open the message at all. All we had to do was click on it. And if we had multiple messages in the inbox, simply clicking through each of the messages would quickly show us the message down here. You can click and drag to change where this divider is, and the same is also true for the right and left version. Once you've enabled that feature in the settings, you'll notice that there's another control over here, and that actually toggles whether or not this pane should exist. If you simply click on it, the pane goes away, but the button stays. If we click on it again, the pane comes back. So this is a fun way to actually have it both ways. You can easily run without the preview pane, or you can run with the preview pane with just a click. And you'll notice that there's a little down arrow here. It'll actually allow you to change whether or not you have a vertical or a horizontal split just as easily. Back to our quick settings. I think that is, let's see, in conversation view. Conversation view. Gosh, this is one of those things that could take a video of its own, because I do think it tends to confuse a lot of people, especially people that have been using email for some time. The idea is simply this. There are two ways to think of email, how it should be displayed. With conversation view turned on, all of the messages that are part of the same conversation, which is really nothing more than having the same subject line, or maybe, with the RE if it's a reply, or FW if it's a forward, but the same subject line, they get grouped together so that you can read them all together without having to jump over any intervening messages. So regardless of when they were sent, Those messages are all grouped together because it's a single conversation. And if you've had a conversation and you haven't had any traffic for a while, maybe it's got 4 or 5 messages, but it was last week since the last one was sent. If someone replies to one of those, then all of a sudden the entire conversation bumps to the top of your inbox because now there's a new message in that conversation, bringing the entire conversation with it. The alternative is, of course, not to have conversation view. And that is the more traditional thing that I think most people are comfortable with. And that is that messages are displayed in the order that they were received, period. There's no attempt to try and figure out which message belongs with which message. It's a very simple view, and I think is probably the easiest for a lot of people to get their brains around. But I know a lot of people, I tend to not use conversation view. I tend to just let the email come in the way it comes in. But then I also, on my personal email, typically run inbox 0. So it's not that big a deal for me to see a few messages in my inbox. If you get a lot of email, if you're having trouble tackling the various conversations that you have, then conversation view might be something worth turning on or worth leaving on, since it is in fact the default. Back to simple or quick settings. Themes. Themes are exactly what you might expect. You get to choose a theme and all of a sudden you've got a background image. You can choose different images. It will actually change, in some cases, the color of the text associated with it. If you view all, you can see that there are many that are available here. There are also very simple themes. Here's the dark theme that basically turns everything black. There's the blue theme. You can see between the two, the text here changed from being black on blue in this case to white on black. There's some simple issues here. There's Google. This is the Google Classic, the default. I believe this is the old version, or this is a high contrast version of Google that tries to focus solely on black and white and make things easier to see. If you want, you are also more than welcome to choose your own photo as your email background. It's something that I do on my personal account. It is convenient, especially as I mentioned earlier, since I have multiple browsers open with different Gmail accounts in each. It's a very quick way for me to realize or to know exactly which account I'm dealing with. So those are themes. Themes are fun to play with. If you like to have a pretty background behind your email, by all means, go ahead and have some fun with that. See all settings. This is where all the other stuff lives. I'm going to run through a number of these very, very quickly, and I'll linger on a couple that I think are the more important ones. Language is obvious, so is phone numbers. The default country code, since I'm in the United States, it's going to be 01. 50 conversations per page. If you have a lot of messages, if you have a lot of email, you can change this. The maximum is 100. If you have a fast internet connection, my tendency is to always go to the maximum so that you have everything right there. Undo send. I want to be clear. There is no way to undo a send. This is a very misleading name for this feature. What this really is delay send. When you hit the send button with the current configuration, it waits for 5 seconds before actually sending the message. Within those 5 seconds, there's an undo button down at the bottom of your screen that you can click to not send the message. You can adjust that time up to 30 seconds. And again, it's not an undo, it's a delay. It will delay the send for the period that you've selected. Default reply behavior, you get to choose which one you want. I believe depending if you leave these unselected, it actually makes a semi-intelligent choice based on what's in the message. Hover actions, I'm going to skip over. Send and archive. When you reply to a message, it is, as it turns out, not uncommon to want to both send the message and then be finished with that conversation. So, archive the original message that you're sending to. This basically combines those features into a single button. When you are composing a message, normally you will just have a send button, and it will do nothing to what's in your inbox. But if you have a send and archive button, then you can send the message and automatically archive the message that you're replying to. Default text style. Absolutely, have some fun with this if you like. The defaults are, as you might expect, somewhat boring, but what this will allow you to do is choose different styles of text and different colors. Now, the one thing I want to caution you on is that this does not change the styles and colors of the fonts actually used to present the Gmail user interface. This is all about the size and the colors and the fonts used in the emails that you compose. And even then, not the emails you compose in plain text mode, but the emails that you compose in rich text mode. So be aware, this is what your recipients will see and actually has nothing to do with the Gmail user interface. External images, I've actually got articles on this on askleo. It's basically if there's an image in a message, should it be automatically displayed? That may, in the case of spam, cause the spammer to realize that, yep, someone actually looked at this message. But because Gmail is so good at filtering spam, I'm actually okay with leaving this turned on to always display so that there is no extra step when I'm viewing a message that includes images. Grammar, up to you. I'm not a big fan of the grammar engine here. Spelling, I can't live without it. It's not as much about spelling for me as it is about typos. Catches my typos all the time. Autocorrect, up to you. I tend not to use autocorrect. I'd rather correct things myself. I've been playing with Smart Compose, and what it will do is it will actually take a look at the words that you've typed so far and kind of sort of predict what you're going to say next. And present those in kind of a light text to the right of your cursor where you're about to type. If you like what they've suggested, you can simply hit the Tab key and it actually accepts the suggestion and moves to the end of it so you can continue. It can save some typing if it turns out to be useful. Experimental access, exactly as it says, sometimes there are experimental features. We've talked about conversation view. I turn it off. Suggest emails to reply to and emails to follow up on. I run into this a lot in my personal emails. What this will allow Gmail to do is, as you are composing a message, it will make suggestions based on who you're entering into the to box as to who else you might want to send this message to. So, for example, if you very frequently send messages to all three of Tom, Dick, and Harry, then when you start typing Tom's email address, it might suggest, hey, do you want to include Dick and Harry as well? Notifications, desktop notifications. So I'm a big fan of turning notifications off. I don't want to get interrupted. However, not everybody wants to be that way. And the kind of notifications that you'll get are the true Windows 10 notifications that you would see here in the little notification icon. You can use stars to organize how you would like to, as a way to organize your messages. I don't, but I know that some people do, and it's a quick way to just sort of flag a message with a star and then be able to filter on or search for or do things with those stars. Button labels. You'll notice that when I'm going to go back to the main user interface here for just a second. When we went to this, we saw that there was a line of icons across here. And you kind of sort of either had to remember what those icons were about or hover over them to remember what they're about. Well, that's what this setting is really all about. If we go back to that setting and go all the way back down to button labels and we say text, now when I save this and I go back to my inbox, you'll see that in fact it's been replaced with words. And as visual as I am sometimes, Words do it for me. This is actually how I have things configured in my main Gmail accounts, simply because, yep, I'll mark it as spam, or I'll archive it, or I'll do whatever. So those are easier for me, for whatever reason, to visually identify and click on quickly. I skipped over shortcuts. There are keyboard shortcuts. There are a bunch of them. You can learn more about what they are. As it turns out, I so rarely ever use them. There are a couple that I do use, and I actually will turn it on. But there's only, like I said, one or two that I spend any time with at all. And it's usually a quick part of archiving messages when I make my first morning pass through my inbox. My picture is back to the Google account. This changes this icon, this picture up here that we were talking about earlier with respect to your Google account. Create contacts for autocomplete. You know what? This one annoys me no end. I will add contacts myself. This is one of the ways you end up with weird email addresses and weird contacts showing up for you, because not only does Google automatically add them to your contacts, but then it starts making suggestions as you're typing, and all of a sudden you're seeing people you don't recognize, and it's because they were automatically added to your contacts for some reason. Let's see, important signals, we're not going to worry about that. Signatures. If you have a standard signature, like you have a URL to your business, or a standard phrase or something like that, or you're just tired of typing your name over and over again, that's what a signature would be. You can create a signature here and then have that automatically added to the bottom of every message you send. Personal levels, I actually kind of find these interesting. It's basically a quick way to identify in the inbox whether a message is being sent only to you, or if it's something that's sent to you but not necessarily only to you. So if it's just to you, you'll get this little double arrow. So you know it's one person or somebody trying to reach you specifically. If you are a recipient, but there may be others, then the single arrow will tell you that you're a recipient, but you're not the only one. It's just, again, a quick visual cue as to potentially how important that message might be. Snippets. Snippets are the little pieces of the message that show up either to the immediate right of or sometimes below the message in your inbox. I find it a convenient way to quickly identify what the message is, so that sometimes I can simply delete it or spam it without even having to open it up. Vacation responders, the infamous out of office reply. If you turn this on, what this will do is it will send a message in reply to anybody that sends you a message. You can specify when it should take place. If you set up such a message, please, please, please only send it to people in your contacts. Otherwise, you're sending it to random strangers and telling them that you're not at home. And you are potentially sending it to random spammers who then are confirmed that the email address that they were just trying to send email to is a real one, and that when you get back from vacation, you'll be reading your email. So that's the General tab. Back to See All Settings. Let's see. Labels. Labels are one of the most misunderstood aspects of Gmail, and I do have what I consider to be a very good article on the topic. What's the difference between Gmail labels, folders, and Gmail labels? Gmail does not have a concept of folders. It just does not. Everything, and I do mean everything, is in one big bucket of email. But the messages themselves are tagged with these labels, and it's the labels that then you are using your interface to filter through. For example, when you click on your inbox, you're looking at all of the messages that have the inbox label. If you're looking at the sent mail folder, well, it's not really a folder. You're looking at all of your messages that have the sent mail label. Now, there are a number of different kinds of labels and different things that you can or cannot choose to see. I, for example, don't use their concept of what it means to be important. I don't use Google Chats, so I don't want to see any folders related to that. I do want to see my sent mail. I don't use scheduled email in Gmail. I have it set to show if unread, which means if there's something in there, that folder will appear. You can see that it's not here now. Drafts. Drafts currently are set to show, but if I instead, and watch the drafts folder here on the left, if I say show if unread, then that folder is going to disappear. That label indicator is going to disappear, and it will only reappear if in fact there is an unread message in my drafts. And that's often what happens when you create a draft, you're composing a message, and you hit escape, it goes into the drafts folder, it's not read. Let's see. All mail is in fact all mail. Everything in your mail that does not have the spam or trash labels. Spam is what you expect. It's everything that has received the spam label, and trash is the stuff that you have explicitly deleted. Now, I want to briefly use this as an opportunity to talk about archives versus deleting. One of the things that Google encourages you to do is to never delete email. What they would prefer you do, the model that they have, is optimized for archiving your email. So what archiving does is essentially it removes all the labels. The only place you might find an archived message is in this all mail folder. And that's a fine place to keep lots and lots of email. I have years and years of email in my all mail folder. I don't delete much of anything. So that's what archiving is. All archiving really is removing all the labels so that it just shows up in the all mail folder. The labels that you add yourself, the manual labels, like we'll get to this confident computing one I've got down here at the bottom, those stay. But things like inbox, for example, get removed so that it shows up, again, only in all mail. When you delete something, it gets marked with the trash label, of course, and you'll find it in your trash, but it'll be automatically and permanently removed after, I believe it's 30 days. I strongly recommend that you seriously consider whether or not deleting is the right thing to do. I have definitely run into situations where emails that I have archived rather than deleting have become incredibly useful at some completely random and completely unknown situation at a later date. So since you've got 15 gigabytes of space by default, consider putting that to use. Consider letting Gmail save in your email by archiving rather than deleting. Categories. Categories are controversial. I have a very definite opinion on them. I hate them. And the reason I hate them is that Google will try to categorize your incoming email as being social, as being an update, as being a forum, or as being promotion. And it will actually move it or keep it out of your inbox, giving it these other labels instead. My experience, as good as Gmail is with spam and identifying spam, they're not perfect, but they're pretty darn good. They just don't seem to be able to get this right. It is very, very common to find emails miscategorized. So I actually turned this off completely, which we'll do on the next tab. So you can see that I actually have all of those hidden in the label list so that they're just not something that I would ever see. I have my own label list and the message list. This, by the way, is the message list, and the label list is I'm trying to think. There's a subtle difference between the two, and it's not coming to mind. So you can create your own labels. So that's your way of basically flagging messages in a way that makes sense to you. As you can see, I have one label that I've created here. It's the Confident Computing Newsletter label. And if we take a look at it as shown here on the left-hand side, it's showing you a Confident Computing newsletter that I sent to this account a couple months ago, as it turns out. But that's all it is. It's a way to label something, and then you can very quickly view all of the messages that have been labeled a particular way. Something I use heavily. While you're seeing only one manual label here, My personal account has probably 30 or 40 or more. Not necessarily manually created. We'll get into that here in just a second as well. But they are definitely used to organize my email as it arrives every day. Very, very powerful. This show if unread is very, very useful. You can see currently it's set to show. Since there are no unread messages, as soon as I say show is unread, show if unread, the label goes away from the left-hand column. But as soon as I get another message that matches or gets labeled that way that I haven't read, the label will actually reappear automatically. So, inbox. Let's have a look at the inbox settings. Categories. This is where I turn them all off. I literally just uncheck social, promotions, updates, and forums. You know, if they work for you, if you find them useful, by all means, have at them. But like I said earlier, I just find them so error prone that I just can't bring myself to turning them on. I can manage my own email. Thank you very much. If you were going to get it right, or if I had some amount of control over what was happening, great, I might reconsider. But as it stands, it's just not a feature I find valuable in any way. Reading pane we talked about. This is another place where you can turn it on and decide where, if it should be to the right or the below. Importance markers. This is slightly different than that recipient marker we were talking about earlier. Gmail, it's kind of funny. I do in fact have this turned on. I can't say that I pay attention to it. If it's hard to see, that's actually a little yellow indicator there between those parentheses. It is kind of interesting. It is something that Google basically decides whether something is important and should get this. They do try to use what you've done in the past, and you can see that there's a setting here that says use my past actions to predict what's important. And it's just, like I said, Google trying to make a guess as to what you might consider to be important, and then flagging it as such. Now, normally that might not seem all that useful other than maybe scanning your inbox looking for the important flag, but it's also something that then can be used when you're creating filters. Now, filters. I'm going to skip over accounts and import for just a second because I want to talk about filters. I mentioned earlier that I had this Confident Computing newsletter label, but I didn't create it manually. What I did was I created a filter on those messages, and you can see that that filter is a simple condition that when a message arrives, if that message meets these criteria, then you have the opportunity to do things. One of them is to apply a label. And you can then create a new label here if you like, or you can choose one of your existing labels. So in this case, if a message comes from Leo at askleo.com and has the word confident in that from name. If you take a look at the newsletter from address, it's actually the email address is leo at askleo.com, and the display name associated with the newsletter is Confident Computing. So if those two things are both in the from field, then there's no other conditions here. That's the only condition I've got. Then we will do these things, and there are a lot of things you can do. You can make it bypass your inbox completely. Just archive it. You can automatically mark it as read. You can put a star on it. You can put a label on it. You can automatically forward it to somebody. Now, that doesn't mean you can spam somebody. It does mean this process of adding a forwarding address does require that the recipient acknowledge their willingness to receive a forwarded message. But you can automatically forward it to a different email address. You can automatically delete it as if it never showed up, which is what some people do with some of the people that are potentially abusing them or spam that they can't, consistently get marked as spam. You can say this should never be spam, which is something that I actually do have for a number of the mailing lists that I'm on, because Gmail seems to want to send many of those to spam. You can always mark it as important. You can never mark it as important. You can categorize it, the categories that we're not using. And then if there were more messages already in your all mail, if you're in your archive that matched any of these criteria, then if there was something to do, like apply a label, you could actually apply that label to all the messages that you had already received that matched that criteria. So filters are incredibly powerful. I really do wish more people would use them to manage their email in some way. It's a great way to ensure that you never miss a message from that important relative or your job or whatever. Just never send it to spam is probably one of the most important things you can do with a filter. But there are so many different things you can do with it, and so many different criteria. Remember, Google is all about search. So when we do something in the search bar, if I say from leo@askleo.com, what we're doing is we're searching. But you'll notice that here, in addition to just being able to hit enter and have that show up, if you hit the drop down, you can now automatically, well, we're already looking at a filter, but normally this would also include create a filter from this search, which is probably the fastest way to create a filter to operate automatically on the email that you receive. When you have a lot of filters, as I do, then coming back here to the filter list and being able to edit what it is you have, what the filters that you have in place, can often be a very, very useful thing. And at a minimum, this is a great place to understand exactly what filters you have in place and why they might be acting on your email. We've been at this an hour. I'm going to keep going for a bit just because there's so much content here. I think this is valuable. And if you were to block email addresses, that would show up here when you can remove them. I want to talk about accounts and import and then forwarding and pop IMAP, because that is probably the next most important thing that I can talk, that I think Gmail is so useful for. Hang on just a second. Since I have been talking for an hour, I need to throw some liquid in my throat. As a quick aside to the question from Game, is it safe to run a registry cleaner if the manufacturer put it on a Lenovo computer? If Lenovo put a registry cleaner on there, then I'd feel safe running it. But in general, I wouldn't feel a need to run it because, as I've said many times, registry cleaners don't really do that much. But at least I would not be scared of a registry cleaner that was provided by the manufacturer. So if you felt the need to run one, yeah, that'd be the one I'd run. So accounts and imports. The top part here, change password, change recovery, other Google account settings, that's all about your Google account. It's not just Gmail, it's your entire Google account. It's here because so many people view Gmail as the only thing they use in Google. And that's fine, but this then would take you to the Google account settings for those specific things. There's a little bit of marketing for people that want to use Gmail for work. Import mail and contacts. So what this does is it reaches out to the other online services, Yahoo, Hotmail, although of course that's now Outlook.com, AOL, or some other webmail or POP3 accounts, and fetches all the email that's there and hopefully fetches all the contacts. My understanding is that import implies it is a one-time action. In other words, if you were moving from Yahoo to Gmail, you might import all of your email once from Yahoo using this function. Send mail as. So one of the deep, dark secrets behind Ask Leo is that even though I have my own email domain, askleo.com, and Puget Sound Software domain, PugetSoundSoftware.com, and I have a personal domain, and I have some other things. I've got Not All News is Bad and Heroic Stories and those kinds of things. All of that email is managed through Gmail. That means, though, that I have to be able to send mail as one of those email addresses. This is how we do that. So if I wanted from this Gmail account If I wanted to be able to send email that comes from leo@askleo.com, this is where I'd set it up. Now, it does require the participation of leo@askleo.com. This is not something you can use to spoof an email from address, but it is something you can use to legitimately send email from a different email address, an email address that is not the email address for your account. It's another email address that you own or you have access to. I do this a lot because, like I said, I manage all of my email in Gmail. So if you've ever gotten email from leo@askleo.com that isn't a newsletter, then that was probably sent by me using a Gmail interface, much like you're seeing here. Check email from other accounts is the reverse. You can check email from the accounts over at other email services. We'll talk about that more completely with POP and IMAP in a second, because in reality they're more useful and they're what I end up using to fetch my email from my other email addresses. Granting access to your accounts lets other people access this email account. Most of you won't need to do that. I might, in a business situation, I might have this kind of access set up for an assistant, but it's not something that most of you will need to worry about. And of course, they're more than happy to take money if you want additional storage in your Google account. And for the record, I did a review, I did some research myself not that long ago, actually, because I needed extra online storage. And as it turns out, Google's was the most cost effective. So for my Google account, I actually have 2 terabytes of storage, and they actually allow you to share that across multiple Google accounts. So that 2 terabytes is shared between both my business and my personal accounts. Forwarding in POP3. So forwarding means that you can automatically forward messages that are received on this account to another email address. So, for example, this is askleotest@gmail.com. If I wanted to, I could automatically forward all of the incoming email on this account to a different email address, like leo@askleo.com. I wouldn't, but I could. It's one approach to backing up. It's one way that you can actually automatically save copies of your email by having it automatically forward everything you get to a different account. POP is how you allow an email program like Thunderbird to access the email in your account. Just a sec. It's a way that you would allow Outlook, as in Microsoft Office Outlook. It's a way that you would allow Thunderbird. It's a way that you would allow other email programs and services to reach into your Gmail account and fetch the email and download it for you. You can, if you've got it enabled, you can tell Gmail what to do. Both the receiving program and Gmail have settings for this, and Gmail's will override. In other words, if you say keep Gmail's copy in the inbox, that's where it's going to stay. That's its way of retaining control. And of course, there are instructions for configuring your email client. So for example, if you needed to know what the correct POP3 servers are and what the settings are and so forth, this is where you'd get the instructions for doing that. That would allow you to access your Gmail account without visiting the website. You could run Thunderbird or Office Outlook on your PC or on your Mac or whatever to access your email that way. IMAP is essentially the same thing. IMAP is a different way of reaching in and fetching your email. The difference is that while POP and POP3 are designed to download your mail to your PC and generally remove it from the server, That's what it's designed for, even though there are ways to override it. IMAP is designed to always leave the email on your server. It's designed such that the server, your Gmail account, becomes the central repository, the one important, the one I'll say canonical repository of your email. And then all of the other programs you might use are simply views onto that one repository. The reason that's so useful and the reason it's become so incredibly popular these days is we have so many more devices reading email, especially mobile. So when you access your email, your Gmail, for example, using maybe the Gmail app on your phone or even another app on your phone or the apps on more than one computer, if you use IMAP, then they will all reflect all the updates that you happen to make. If you delete an email from your phone, well, it gets deleted everywhere else. If you reply to an email, well, that reply is shown everywhere else. You get the idea. IMAP is a great way to manage a single email account across multiple different machines. And if you're going to do that, it's what I strongly recommend you use. To go back, I realize I misspoke earlier. So this forwarding and pop IMAP are all about what happens to the email that is sent to this Gmail account. Accounts and import is what happens to email that is sent to other accounts or is sent on behalf of other accounts. We talked about sending email as. If I wanted to receive email from, if I wanted to receive the email that was being sent to leo@askleo.com, I would add that mail account here. And I would, add leo@askleo.com and go through the process of configuring this Gmail instance to give it permission and the appropriate configuration information to go over to the mail server, whatever mail server that might be, that currently handles askleo.com email, and give it permission, give Gmail permission to fetch that email and have that email then show up in my Gmail inbox. That's exactly how I handle all of the Ask Leo email and all of my personal email for that matter, because I actually don't use publicly my Gmail addresses. I always use my own domains, and this is how I manage them. Let's see, a couple of final things to touch on. You may remember I said we would talk about Chat and Meet. This is where we make them go away. If we save changes now, you'll see that these guys after the refresh are now gone. They're not in your way. They're not in your face. They're just not something. If you use them, and I know that some companies, I believe, are using Chat and Meet. If you use them, great. Leave them there. Let them be visible. Use them as you see fit. But if you're at all like me and you just want to have the space back, and by the way, if you have lots of labels like I do, that then frees up that space to display more of your labels if you like. That's what I prefer. I just don't want them in my face. I'm never going to use them. And if for some reason I decide I need to use them, I can always come back here and turn them back on. Offline, real quick, offline email, actually download some additional software that allows you to read and compose messages if you're not connected to the internet, even though you're using a web browser to do it. It's not something I use because I'm almost constantly connected. And if I'm going to write something while I'm not connected, I'll probably write it in a different program anyway. But it is, or it can be useful if it's a situation you find yourself in from time to time. I prefer to leave it off just because I don't want any additional overhead in the browser. I don't want any additional overhead in the interface. Any additional work that it has to do, I just prefer not to have it do. We've talked about themes. This is another place to set the theme for this. And then in advanced, there are a couple of settings here. For example, what should happen after you delete a message? Should it go to the next one or should it go back? Do you want to be able to use templates? Do you want to create your own keyboard shortcuts? The chat box that we just got rid of, would you rather have that on the other side? Unread message icon is probably the only one of these that I would recommend you turn on, especially if you've got notifications turned off. And I say that because once it's enabled, we should see it here, I hope. Yes, you can see here now in the very upper left of the screen, the little tab icon for Gmail now has a number next to it. That number is the number of unread messages. If I were to mark this as unread, you can see that number changes to 1. It's simply a shortcut that says, hey, you've got an unread message. It's another visual indicator that something is going on that you might want to pay attention to. And like I said, with me, since I've got notifications turned off, there's so many things competing for my time. I just don't need email notifying me all the time. This is another way that lets me see that information on my own terms. Let's see. I think now's a good time. If you have any questions about any of the stuff that I've talked about so far, I think I've covered everything that I intended to. Add-ons, there are add-ons available for Gmail. Very often they are commercial add-ons from third-party providers. I think I have 1 or 2. Very often they are contact management, CRM for businesses, those kinds of situations. But this is where you would manage what those add-ons are. I'm not sure. I can't think of any really useful add-ons at this point for the general public. But you may find a need, and this would be the place to manage what you've got. And I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to talk about. As expected, we don't have time for Outlook.com. Gmail, to me, like I said, is more important in the sense that it is being used by far more people than any other email interface, an email service on the internet. Outlook.com may very well be next just because of the prevalence of Microsoft accounts, but the fact is Gmail is still the big gorilla. Outlook.com doesn't have nearly as many features or the functionality that Gmail does, nor is its spam filter as good. I keep hoping that it'll get better over time, but the fact is it still seems like it misses a lot. It really does. And it's not quite as responsive to marking things as junk as Gmail is. Gmail, to me, does a better job of actually listening to me when I mark something as spam a number of times, then eventually it starts showing up in spam. Or conversely, if I mark something as not spam that I found in the spam folder, it does a better job of not marking that as spam in the future. So with that, that's gmail.com. Like I said, I really appreciate the features and functionality of the tool. It is the email interface that I use, I live in every day. It is probably one of the most important tools in my arsenal. If I were to switch, I'd probably have a dilemma of switching between Outlook.com as a web interface, or because I could certainly get my email addresses managed by Outlook.com, or if I'd switch to a desktop email program like Microsoft Outlook, which I've been tempted to do from time to time for various reasons. So if there are no more questions, then I will call this good. I want to thank you all for attending today. I hope you found this at least marginally helpful and informative. If you're a Gmail user, I hope you found a trick or two that you can put into use. Until next time, I am Leo Notenboom. This is askleo.com. Thanks as always for watching, and I will see you again next time. Bye-bye.